All right, here we are live on the Trauma Informed Educators Network with this number 45. I actually put on the graphic 44 one and then 45 on another. I couldn't remember what episode it is, and it doesn't really matter because we're here to talk to Dr. Tracey Benson, who is a very gifted writer and thought-provoking practitioner that has written an amazing book that I just finished reading in an amazing book club in my district in Nashville, and it is The Unconscious Bias in Schools. So, Dr. Benson, we're going to jump in, man. We've got a lot to talk about, and we kind of talked beforehand. But the first question I need to ask you is just tell us the Dr. Benson story.
Oh, great. Well, thanks so much, Matt, for setting this up. I really feel honored and blessed that you would take time to focus in on my work and the things that I do, and myself and my co-author. We put our heart and soul into this book, so I appreciate you reading it and also having me on your show. And it's sort of serendipitous that I'm number 45, right? That number 45 has a special meaning in politics, right? And so I'm the number 45 on your show. So the as a black man talked about anti-racism. Uh-oh, I can't
I froze up. I'm so sorry.
There
and
we
I
go.
heard, isn't it serendipitous that I'm 45? Yes, absolutely.
It just hit me right now. So that's awesome.
Sorry.
I get to be 45. Black men talk about anti-racism. Wearing an anti-racist shirt. I'm the 45.
It is meant to be. It is meant to be. Definitely. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I froze up. That isn't something that normally happens.
No problem. It's folks that they're about to keep it real, so let's pause them. So my story, I'm originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I grew up in the city. So if you know folks from, I mean, we're not everywhere, right? But folks from Wisconsin, people typically like to say that they're from Milwaukee, but there's a whole lot of suburbs around Milwaukee. I'm actually from the city. So for those who know Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I lived in the city, right? I'm one of six, and my educational journey with sort of learning about the ins and outs of white supremacy started really young, because after second grade, I grew up in a very low-income household, going to our local school. And after second grade, my mother chose to enroll us in a program called the 220 program. And what the 220 program was billed as an opportunity for kids from the city to be bused out to the suburban schools, to integrate the suburban schools, right? And this is back in the late 80s, early 90s. And so my mom enrolled us into that program, and I went to Brown Deer Elementary, Middle, and High School, starting in the third grade. And so what I did know is that at my local school, I was one of the smart kids. That I was in the second grade. I was in the highest reading group. I was sent to third grade for math. And this was just because I had older brothers and sisters, and I was very competitive. And so I wanted to learn how to read and write very, very young. But when I got to the white school, 95% white, I was in the third grade. I was just another one of the black kids, and that I was a poor kid who came from Milwaukee, who wasn't intelligent enough, never tested for gifted, even though at my previous school I was gifted, and just treated as a second-class citizen. And it really, at a young age, I knew something was happening based on my skin color, but I couldn't verbalize it. Just like a lot of kids today. They know something's happening, but they can't quite verbalize it, but they know they're being treated different, right? And I had this racial awakening really in the fifth grade. And it was a moment when I was coming out of art class. And our art teacher required us to have these gallon milk jugs where we cut off the top and put all our art supplies in it. So I'm carrying my jug with my smock over my shoulder, because we were required to have a smock and old shirt. I'm walking down the hallway, and I see one of my friends, white friend. He was in a 220 program, but that's because he was poor, right? And so we would play this game where we sneak up behind each other and shut each other's locker, right? Middle school kids, right? And so I saw him at his locker. He didn't see me. So I snuck over him real quick, tapped him on his shoulder. He turned around from the other side. I shut his locker. I laughed. He sort of chuckled a bit, and I kept on walking, right? This is a game we knew. A few steps down the hallway, a teacher comes up beside me. I don't see him. He grabs my art supplies out of my hands, and he dumps them out right in the middle of the hallway. Throws my gallon cart down and says, "How does it feel?" And then he walked off. And being I thought I'm one of the good kids, right? So I go down. I'm like, what is this about? So I go down and put my art supplies back in my container, and I just pick. I don't protest. I don't scream. I just keep walking to class. And stunned, I'm like, why would this happen? I'm one of the good kids. So when I'm almost in my class, he comes up behind me. This is a white male, Mr. Evans is his name. Comes up beside me and puts his arm around me and tries to explain to me why he did what he did, right? I can't hear a word he's saying. I just know his hand's on me, so I take his arm and I push it off.
Right.
He then whips around, furious, puts his finger almost touching my nose, gets in my face, said, "Do you want to start with me?" Right? And I'm like, whoa, where did this come from, man? I'm like, no, I don't want to start with you. What? Like the worst thing that could happen in my household is to get a call home from the teacher. I don't want that to happen. You know?
Right.
I'm like, no, I don't. And then he walks away, and I'm like, through the rest of the day, I'm like, I'm one of the good kids, right? Why would this happen to me? It's those other Black kids who are causing problems. They get treated like this. I'm one of the good kids. But from that moment on, I began to see more and more about how the white teachers are treating the Black kids. I knew something was wrong, but it became painstakingly obvious that regardless of how smart you were, what socioeconomic class you came from, if you are Black, you get treated differently. And the moment you step out of line, even if you have no history of misbehavior, you are instantly overpoliced in the school building. So that was my racial awakening. And that is how I got into this sort of and I started reading lots of Du Bois and like very young kid, these books from folks who write about race. And I kept, on this pattern throughout my middle school, high school, and in the college. I was a sociology major and I took a lot of Black thought classes. And then when I got into education, and both my parents are educators. My mother's a counselor in Milwaukee Public Schools. My dad was a special ed teacher for a time. So I had this passion to work with Black and brown kids in Black and brown schools. And still following my passion for anti-racism, implemented my classroom, and then when I became an AP to a principalship, and did a lot of great things that I write about in the book as a principal, but still didn't know enough. So I wanted to go back and get my doctorate, and that's what I did. And following that, I had a choice to go superintendency, academia. I chose to go to academia, so I can continue to write and build my dexterity and my knowledge base around anti-racism and what it looks like in the school building. And so I chose to go academic route, and that's what I write, publish, speak on. And most recently, I left my position to do this work full-time as a consultant. And I launched the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute, where I work with school districts, education-based organizations, colleges, and universities from around the world on what it means to be an anti-racist educator. So that's my story.
So my first question is, what would you tell your middle school self now that you wish you would have known before that experience? Like, what would you have told your younger self?
I would have, at that moment when that happened to me, I would have told myself to take it further. That I didn't tell my mother. And my parents were race conscious, so they were definitely how this understood that you're a Black person in this world, and we have to be careful, when we're in white spaces, because Milwaukee is it's one of the most segregated cities in the U.S., right? And we didn't go to the South Side, we didn't go to certain malls because we were Black. We'd be treated accordingly, and so he taught us who we were. But at that moment, I would have said, advocate. Go to the principal's office, talk to Mr. Peters about what just happened, and then go home and tell your mother what happened to you, because that's inappropriate on every level. But realizing also that the Black kids are getting treated differently, and I am one of the good kids, but I am being discriminated against as well. And really advocate and say it's a color thing, and I see that. Not to say that I would have, because I was kind of meek, mild, and quiet then, but I would have had that conversation, and it helped me realize that this is the nature of life, and this is going to be your journey and your path. So I would have given myself a pep talk about be more resistant.
And I feel that I think now that's one of the most powerful things of the movements that we see happening across the country. Even here in Nashville, 4 high school kids planned and implemented a protest with over 10,000 people using their voices, right? And it was so powerful to see young people standing in a space that, when I was naive and had no experience. So I didn't even understand, to be quite frank and honest, and even what racism was, because I grew up in a predominantly all white community, and it just wasn't talked about. It was talked about, but not, it was talked about in those undertone ways, right? But the power of our kids these days that are just feel so, and I think it's amazing. That's ultimately one of our goals for our students at the school that I'm the principal, and that's that they find their voice we call it habit 8, right? It's so important. And I love that. So let's get into your book, because I'm so into your book, and actually I'm finished your book, but let's just start at the ground level. Like, why unconscious bias in schools? That was an experience one. What is unconscious bias in schools? Like, just give us the basics.
So Sarah and I, so Sarah invited me onto the project. I was her teaching fellow when I was getting my doctorate, and I worked for the aspiring school administrators master's program. So myself and my good friend, Dr. Cesar Cruz, we were both the TS for the course, and we were charged. So it was 1 white male, 2 white females, and myself, who am African American, and Cesar, who's Mexican American, and we were charged with sort of the diversity work of the group. So every Friday we had these sessions with the students and us to run these sort of diversity sessions, right? We didn't come, and so in doing that, we got the opportunity to really imprint on leaders what our thinking was, and deepen their knowledge around what racism and anti-racism was. And through that experience, Sarah then, after I graduated, called me because she wrote an article called Unconscious Bias in Schools, and she got tapped to write a book. And she's like, well, why don't you come write it with me? I'm like, cool, I was gonna write a book anyway, let's roll with this, right? And I saw it as a great opportunity for someone who's a Black male and a white female to write a book together. Right? Because we both have what we thought to be similar goals and similar outcomes, but we come from 2 totally different worlds. And these worlds collided in this book. And I think that's the power of it. What's not included in this book is a tremendous struggle for people who come from 2 totally different backgrounds, 2 totally different places in their identity, and also in their racial identity development, coming together and having to agree upon how to approach the work, right? And this book was only supposed to take 16 months. It took almost a little over 2 years. Because what we capture in the first, and I think in the second chapter, when we talk about our relationship, it's a small part of the book, but that is the majority of our going back and forth. I left the project twice, I got, upset. We come to these points where we had the racism was acting out within our relationship.
I could feel it. I could feel it in the book. I'm not gonna lie. I could feel it in the book.
But we stuck it out, and we came back together, and we wrote the book that we wish we would have had when we were principals. That's what we decided on. Like, what kind of guidance do we wish we had? And when I write about my experiences, I didn't have the language, the framing, the dexterity to talk about things outside of using proxy words. I would never say anti-racism in the school building. I would never say white supremacy in the school building, because I didn't have the words, the holding, and I was still stuck in my own sort of self-developed cognitive barriers, my negative self-talk about what it meant for me to use these words in the school building. And so we chose to write this book because we wanted to write it for principals who would have a better framing, a framing that we didn't have the opportunity to have when we were principals.
Well, and I'll tell you, I've used it. And I told you before we got on to this podcast that I've already used some of the painstaking work that you and your co-author went through. But I think too that the first, I think it was in the first chapter, or maybe it was in the second, when you go into seeking to escape the discomfort, especially for predominantly white faculty and staff, that is such a powerful idea that we have to get past when we're having these conversations in schools, because the discomfort is where the growth happens, and honesty and all of the other pieces. And what you just said is you modeling that, right? Like, you were like, I'm out. No, wait, I'm back. Like, okay, I'm out. No, I'm back. And I think that process, first, that's how relationships are developed, right? Through all of those processes. But the hard work comes in when maybe we realize our feelings get hurt, but then we process why. So what has that experience been like with you working with schools, particularly around that discomfort?
It's it's 2-pronged, right? We have to have tremendous amount of grace with each other, tremendous amounts, right? Because it's a cyclical problem. We work in schools with kids, and within these schools, we mold minds. We teach them a number of things: how to think critically, how to read, how to add, subtract, and a whole litany of things we teach kids. But we never teach kids how to talk about race. We actually teach them to be racially illiterate. you know? So when we go through from K to 12, learning a whole bunch of things, and we also learn how to be race silent. You know, Michael Pollock writes this book called Color Mute. We learn how not to talk, that it's taboo to talk about, that unless we get it absolutely correctly, we cannot have these conversations. I've had conversations about racism with kindergartners before they've learned to censor themselves, before they learn the normative frames of talking about race in the schoolhouse, before they learn that, and they're very open and honest, and they say things that are so just because they see and they know, and you ask them the right questions and they'll tell you. But you try to have these same conversations with folks in high school and then also with adults, they don't have the literacy, right? Because we haven't practiced it in school building. We've learned not to talk about race. So we have to have a tremendous amount of grace that as adults, we just don't have the capacity to do it because we've been taught not to, right?
And in that too, I think one of the lines in the book was that part of that grace is saying things like, I hear you talking about intentions, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not questioning your intention. I'm questioning your impact. And that's where that act of grace, but then in the other part of the chapter is encouragement, not reassurance, right? Like, I hear you, but I'm actually talking about the impact. Like that whole connection and idea piece, not only does it go into these conversations, to me, that goes into every conversation we should be having in schools, right? But particularly in these.
Right, and it's so much harder with race because as we write about this, and Robert DiAngelo talks about this too, the good non-racist, bad racist binary. This is so prevalent that the worst thing that you could call a white person who thinks they're a good white person is racist, right? That's like crushing, you know? And we're not talking about your intent. We're talking about your impact, but also we have to understand that we've all ingested racial bias, even people of color. Right? Because we live in a highly racialized society that we learn at a very, very young age what race is, that white is at the top and black and brown is at the bottom. And the doll test that's been conducted by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, where, you know, I think you've heard of this test where they got together a group of 5-year-olds and they brought them in one at a time to a room, these two black psychologists, and they gave them an opportunity, the option to play with either a white doll or a black doll, choose one. And most of the kids, regardless of the color of the kid, chose the white doll. And then when they're asked to describe the white doll, they said it looked nice and friendly. But when they're asked to describe the black doll, they said it looked dirty and bad. And so they learned this at 5 years old. That means even if they haven't been explicitly taught, from the stimulus from television, from these days, social media, computers, from advertising, they learn what is the preferred race. And so we have to understand that we have ingested these things, but also that most folks want to see them as free of it, especially good white people want to see them free of racism. So having that grace to be like, okay, we know you're stuck in this binary. You don't realize that you've ingested this racial bias. Let's have the patience that me, as someone who's approaching it, it's actually my responsibility to meet you where you are. Right? And if you're showing signs of defensiveness, that means I've come in at too high of a level. How can I approach it in a way to disarm you in a way that we can both be on the same page to serve kids? Because I know you care about kids.
And I think that's it right there. Like, listen, we're having a conversation because, and I did share with you, and I've shared it openly, that as a white kid that grew up in a all white community, ended up moving to Nashville and going to a HBCU. I had no idea the bias and even the racism that I possessed. I had no clue. And I think that sometimes we see this as such a far away thing, and we see it with people who wear a certain regalia that represent what white supremacy is on the big media scale, right? But we don't understand that this is embedded. This is embedded so deeply into our culture that when people stand up against it, people actually think they're standing up against American culture itself as the foundation. And so I think what you're saying is we have to be conscious, right? We have to be cognizant when those ideas roll into our head, because it happens. It happens to me. It happens to you. It happens to everyone. So what do you say to people like, when you talk about the non-binary part of racist, anti-racist, what does a journey, or what has your journey felt and look like when you're processing the bias and unconscious bias that comes into you as a human being?
Yeah. Well, you said a lot of powerful things there that I just want to unpack just for a moment, before I get to the question. I'm going to ask you to come back to that too, because the question at the end is very important. And so hold that. But you said two things prior to that when you're talking about your story, right? You grew up in a primarily white neighborhood, and that was your upbringing until you went to the HBCU, and you learned more about the Black culture community. You had to undo a lot of those ingested biases because of residential segregation, right? We're residentially segregated. So what we learn about other races is typically from the television, especially the white race, because the white race learns about other people of color from the television because there's not that social distance, social proximity to being close to people of color. And so we're filled with all these biases that we learn through television and the media. And I want you to imagine the antithesis to that, right? So you went through a whole life, and then you had this very intense period of being immersed in the Black community and the Black culture, and coming out the other end, and still, I don't know what your life looks like, but you had this moment. And you picture the typical experience of a person of color. We spend almost our entire lives in white culture, right? And in spending time among the white race. So our depth of knowledge around the interplay of racism in society is immense. Our awakening happens very, very young. And that's why I wear the shirt called Listen to Black Women, and I wear that all the time, right? With these intersectional identities that understand very clearly the dynamics of race and gender in society, and who are our knowledge keepers around this, that we have to listen to and take into account the depth of knowledge. These folks, even if they're not anointed experts, but not expecting them to serve us, but if they do come to the table to want to give us and share their knowledge, we have to be willing to listen and take that in, because there's such deep knowledge there. And the second thing I heard you say is, oh shoot, I forget, because there was a point that I was going to make. What's the second thing you said? You talked about your journey in HBCU, and then do you remember what you said next?
I think I was talking about how racism is such a part of our culture that when people actually stand up against it, that people think you're actually standing up against America itself.
Right. And so this is, of course, again, the binary, right? That just as long as we are, most of us I consider myself to be a left-leaning sort of liberal person who understands more along the lines of, like, America has a lot of racism, sexism, all the phobias we talk about, homophobia and Islamophobia, that exists within our psyche. We have to raise that and address it. And at the same time, we have to have a lot of empathy for those who we might see as across the table, right? Because I have colleagues, a lot of these very liberal, left-leaning colleagues who consider themselves to be anti-racist, and a marker of their anti-racism is not being connected to those white people over there, right? And the more distance I can put between me and them is a marker of my anti-racism. And I argue that's the wrong way to be. You're actually working against the interest of anti-racism, because you're pushing apart those folks over there. Just because you're not like them, you are the good people, right? And we have to understand we're all on the learning continuum. And so for us to judge them, lest we be judged. And so the real work is bringing ourselves closer and beginning to understand where these folks are coming from. I've had conversation with folks who are as right-leaning about racism, right-leaning as you can think. One step short of wearing a hood out in public, and going to a rally. And when you just listen to where their thoughts and their beliefs and their passion and their anger comes from, it comes from a very intense sense of loss. And that's a pure emotion. It's not a hate. We try to address it as hate, right? But it comes from a pure emotion of loss. And what is that loss? It's a loss of the innocence of thinking of yourself as of someone who's got someone out of meritocracy, not because of your skin color. It's a loss of the ability to not have to talk about race and not have to think bad about your country. Because prior to, when you're blissfully ignorant, everything was great. Everything was sunshine and rainbows, right? But then when you're learning that you've been willfully ignorant and blind, and now you have to talk about these really tough, hard things and wrestle with this, it makes you angry, because it's this tremendous, and it comes from this very deep, tremendous sense of loss. I've lost my innocence, and I want that back. And so when we look at folks demonstrating and folks wanting to ban critical race theory and folks wanting to, it often doesn't come from a place of hate, it comes from a place of loss, right? And so we can't put these people over there. We have to draw them closer so we can really understand where it comes from. And often it's not from a place of hate. Okay.
That's valid. And at the end of the day, you're right? And I think the polarization is happening on an extreme level on every piece, right? Not just these topics, but many topics. And I'm going to be honest, I come from a family where there's me and then there's like everybody else. And I don't mean that in the way you just talked about, but it is, we have a lot of conversations. And ironically, my mom has just recently passed, and up until her passing, we had a lot of really deep conversations. And the more I started to understand her perspective, especially when it came to these kind of topics, the more I understood a lot of it was what you just said, right? A lot of it was driven in fear and trying to grapple with some of the things that she had maybe experienced when she was younger and didn't understand the complexities of things. It was just interesting. And you're spot on it. Carmen Korn on LinkedIn says, so this begs the question, is it possible to erase racist bias? What do you think, Dr. Benson?
Is that the goal?
Right.
Is that the goal? That's the question. Like, what is the goal? What are we replacing it with? You know, I don't have a definitive answer to that, right? We don't want to become one race. That's not the goal. We have to, you know, recognize that one, race is a social construct, right? That was developed as an antithesis to whiteness, right? That's the nexus of it. If you think about sort of the intellectuals that write on the subject of race, that it's been changed and morphed over time, right? Because there was a time in our country, in our recent history, that Italians weren't white, that Irish weren't white, that you had all these different gradations of white people that weren't white. But the idea of whiteness has taken on another meaning that has been synonymous with power and oppression, right? And so we have to decouple the concept of whiteness. So when we say anti-white supremacy, what we mean is we have to decouple what it brings along with it, which is the hoarding of power for the purposes of gain to oppress Black and brown people, right? And the reason that this whole concept of whiteness has grown and people have been, you know, consolidated into the Italians are white, the Irish are white, all the folks that weren't white previously, is to maintain that white supremacy and that white power, right, over others. So we have to decouple the power conversation, also the oppression conversation. As far as the idea of race is, once we decouple power and oppression from the idea of race, it no longer becomes a problem, right? You know, there can be interpersonal racism, you know, and that we'll always have to deal with it. Just like there's interpersonal sexism, just like there's interpersonal homophobia, you know, interpersonal differences around religion. That's always going to exist about personal preference. But when we decouple power from it, it doesn't hold as much gravity in terms of being able to determine the direction of a particular race of people.
Yeah. You didn't put that in your book, but I 100%, it just, my brain is spinning. I wish I could formulate as many questions that's happening in my mind, but it's true. And I think that one thing too, when we start getting into these conversations, we know statistically that in schools, unfortunately, the highest statistic of any teacher in school is a white female, right? Predominantly a younger white female. So there's this idea of, that I see regularly, and I know there is an actual term for it, but I don't know what it is. So I'm just going to call it what it is. And it's this idea of white saviorism, of having to go and help not even just brown and Black kids, Dr. Benson, but the poor kids, right? What do you think? I mean, how do you respond to that? So if I'm interviewing someone and they start talking about this, this has always been my goal and mission to, you know, work in a low income area. What do you respond?
Yeah. I call it the domestic missionary, the domestic missionary. We call it missionary mindset, but I say the domestic missionary mindset, because this mindset is actually incredibly okay in a lot of religions if we go someplace else and do it, right? This missionary mindset that if we just bring our Western ways to these other people who we see as destitute, who see themselves as just fine, we bring our ways, our thinking, our religion to them, it's okay because we are the good Western people, right? So it's extremely okay when we do that, which is not okay, by the way. But we have to understand where this sort of the portal to this missionary mindset in Black and brown schools came from. Okay, because prior to 1954, we remember that we had segregation, right? And during this time of segregation, we had the majority of folks who worked in Black schools were Black people. Now, they might have been in disheveled schools with old curriculum materials, getting paid a barely minimum wage, but they were still working. All these people that we celebrate during Black History Month went to Black schools. We have to remember that it produced a lot of very innovative inventors, leaders, innovators came from these Black schools in these Black places, right? And when the Brown decision, the Brown case came about, the Black community was not asking for integration. They're asking for equal resources. And the biggest mistake we've made, is to try to solve the problem of resources with integration, because it's never worked, right? Because we have to understand that if there's been a country that has oppressed Black people for centuries, we're oppressed by white people. These white people are not all of a sudden going to want to put their kids in schools with these Black people they used to oppress, right? These people they used to be able to keep over there, right, in their segregated communities, in their segregated schools. They're like, oh, well, integration, let's do it. That's not, and it hasn't happened from that same mentality.
Right.
But what we will do now that post 54, what happens was when these Black and Brown school districts were annexed into these white districts with new regulations on teaching credentials, hundreds of thousands of Black educators lost their jobs.
Yep.
We essentially broke the legacy of the Black educator after post 1954. Hundreds of thousands across the country of Black educators lost their jobs. And also principals and also superintendents lost their jobs and were replaced by whites, mainly white women. And so now we have this, flash forward, and we've had this influx of white people into these Black and Brown schools, bringing along with them the racial biases and the deficit thinking and the ways in which they see Black and Brown folks that they used to be able to keep over there. We also have this idea like we're coming to save, because we always thought about the Black community before they were in a deficit. That's why we don't want them near us. Right? It's the same mentality. We don't want them near us. We see them as a deficit. But now if we're going to come in, we still don't want them near us. We're not going to live in your community, right? We're going to come and work in your schools to save you people over here. But I'm going to go back and live in my community and send my kids to different schools, right? Because your schools aren't good enough, but I'm coming to lend my time, my whiteness, my goodness to you and leave. Okay, and so this missionary mindset is something we have to address, considering our current state of affairs, but we also must realize that we have a moral imperative to restore the means of production of Black education to the Black community. Right? People who live, work, spend their money in their community should be eligible to work in their schools. And we have never had that conversation about restoration of what we broke and took away post 1954.
But and now it's interesting that you go into that, because I've read a lot about that, and I know in South Carolina, I think there were 634 African American principals prior to desegregation, and then there was, I think, 112 literally right after 1954. So, or whenever they desegregated. In Nashville, I know that our school district didn't desegregate until almost in the early 70s. And so just because that court case happened, right, some of these things did not happen very long ago. And so what do you see as, how does that restore? How do we as a field of education restore that?
Well, we go beyond words, right? We go beyond forays. We hear this sort of national narrative right now, like we need more Black educators, especially Black male educators, as if it's a phenomenon that we didn't create.
Right, exactly.
That we have to get in touch with like how it happened, right? It was very purposeful, and it happened not too long ago that we disappeared the Black educator, right? So what does restoration look like? Just like the idea of reparations, right? We haven't had an equal and opposite response. Like if we can purposely drive Black and Brown educators out, we can purposely bring them back in. Right? Using the same measures that we did before, like we raised all of so we know that the Black and Brown educators in these segregated communities didn't have access to means for credentials. They just simply did not have it because it wasn't available. Didn't mean that they couldn't teach in their schools, but right now we've created such a bar, and of course this cyclical pattern of under-resourced and underfunded in Black and Brown schools, that we created this bar for teaching, this arbitrary bar, by the way, because I've done a lot of research around what makes a skilled and effective teacher, that there's little research that says you need a bachelor's degree in order to be a good teacher. There's a lot of countries, one that we have right to ourselves, Cuba, that does not require you to have a college degree to be a teacher. And it's not logical that you have to have a 4-year degree to teach kindergarten, to teach first grade, to teach second grade, right? These are basic skills. You can have a high school diploma and teach in those grades, but we made these arbitrary bars for the purposes of, hoarding the opportunity, or closing the sort of portal to become a teacher. We really need to rethink that, because we've cut the legs out of the Black community, raised the bar to a level that doesn't make any sense, and then not allow the Black educator to get back in.
Again, I know I was on a forum, and somebody said, there was a comment that this system is broken, and somebody responded, actually, it's not. It's working exactly how it's designed. And I think that's what you're saying. Like, why is anybody shocked that we don't have Black male educators? Like, I mean, it was by design that we didn't. So I love that. So let's talk about the intersection. I don't love that there's, I hope you understand, I don't love that happened. I love that you said it. So what I was going to say was that let's talk about... I gotcha. Yeah, no, we got to keep it rolling. No, I gotcha. We're on the same page. So let's talk about the intersection between this anti-racism work, trauma-informed, restorative practices, because these things are all floating around it, right? And all of these intersecting ideas are starting to merge their way together. So how do you see all of this work coming together?
Ooh, oh boy, so many layers, and of course also social emotional learning, right?
Absolutely.
Right. These are all things that are like swirling out there of ways in which we're going to sort of improve the sort of social conditions of our schoolhouse, right? And all to the detriment of anti-racism, right? Racism is the crux of a lot of the harm we're doing to communities of color and people of color in schools. However, we often like to proxy with these ideas of restorative justice, with ideas of trauma-informed practice, right? That are often very sort of try to be race neutral. When we say race neutral, that means the default is white. The SEL framework, which I've been having these conversations with Castle for years, right? Around how they have the static framework that is supposed to be just applicable to any student, right? Not acknowledging that the school is a racialized place, a racialized space, that you can't have the static model to apply anywhere because the default is white, right? These expectations. So you have to racialize it in a way that recognizes that school is a racialized space. And what I mean by racialized space is we show up of different colors and backgrounds, and we have to understand that the same dynamics we see in society in terms of the racial subjugation of Black and brown people happens in our school building via practices, policies, curriculum, pedagogy, beliefs. It all shows up in our school building. But it's so normalized that when we talk about unconscious bias, it should be called normalized racism, because it's so normal that we often just don't pay attention to it. It's in our language and the way we think about the Black and brown community. And so when we're talking about trauma-informed practices, we need to include racism as a part of trauma. The racism that Black and brown folks experience in society, meaning that purposeful underemployment, the unfair treatment of Black and brown folks in the medical system, over policing, all of these aspects affect the Black community when it comes to the ability to have a gainful and productive life. And then also within the schoolhouse, like racism is trauma to kids. There's research out there about the psychological impacts of microaggressions, meaning just treating Black kids as second-class citizens, even with a flippant comment, even with, in a classroom. And I used to teach a class when I was a professor on supervision of instruction. And I would have my students go in and watch teacher-student interactions and just take it in terms of race and gender, right? How is the teacher interacting with students based on their race and gender? And 95% of my students would see a race and gender dynamic in every classroom. Imagine the psychological impact on a first grader that is constantly not getting called on by their teacher because they are of color. And the white boy, who doesn't even raise his hand, blurts out, and is like, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to redirect you because you have privilege in this classroom. And so when we talk about trauma-informed instruction, the trauma, we're actually delivering a lot of the trauma within our schools.
Absolutely.
We're not addressing racial bias in our policies, practices, and in our classrooms.
And one of your suggestions in your book is to record and to see how your interactions are. And I think that's powerful. You can't deny if you're going to record these things and watch and learn and be open to going, why do I keep always targeting even the side of the room or this child, or why am I not targeting, or why do I continually say this student's name all of the time, which I see often. Like I constantly hear the same kids' names coming up. So let's get into another piece, because I do want to get into this. And I told you 45 minutes is going to go long, so we're probably going to have to stay on here another 60.
Look at this, we're going, flowing. I love this.
But let's get into, you really talk about bias starts on how we interpret students' behaviors. And I think that's such a powerful piece of your book, because that is where we see a lot, and it's just one of the many pieces that we have to do work in, right? So talk me through that, and then I want to get into what you talked about, having fair systems and structures around when you're talking about behavior and discipline, right? So, but first let's talk about the behavior piece and how we perceive behavior through a biased view.
Right. Oh my goodness. And there are a number of studies about this. But I'm gonna talk about my own experience, and I talk about this in the book. I was a principal, at a school that had around 15% students of color, 85% white students, and I think 99.9% of the staff were white. And I had this practice, right? And I was called into a school that had been through 5 principals in 4 years, and I was the next one to come in, and so they were having some struggles. And so I was placed in there, as the next principal, and I was determined not to leave within that year, right? I was like, I'm coming, I'm staying, we're doing some things, right? We're struggling, and so I developed a whole course of systems, a lot of systems, and one of them was to reduce the number of negative student interactions in the hallways, right? Because they had a number of fights every year before I got there, in the paper for fights at one point in time prior to me getting there. So I was like, we're not going to have a single fight in the building the whole time I'm here, right? And I almost achieved that, but my last year I had one. I was like, But part of reducing that was to be hyper vigilant in the hallways and always keeping students moving, right? We're in this old building that was built in the 1930s. The hallways are large, but yet we had 1,000 students, so sometimes it can get really crowded. But one way to avoid tiffs in the hallway is to keep kids moving. And so every time the bell would ring, myself and every teacher, aide, whoever, had to come out into the hallway, right? Talk to kids, greet them, keep it moving. Anytime students were congregating, you got to keep them going, right? And so one day I was in the hallway, and I saw a group of students congregating, and I thought, just like I always did, went up to them like, all right, guys, let's keep it moving. And I was never like yelling, what are you doing? Like, let's keep it moving. And one of my students, Derek, is like, Mr. Ben, I want doctorate. He's like, I want to come talk to you down in your office, about something. And I was like, okay, go downstairs and wait. And he waited in the office, and I came back down, and he came into my office. He's like, Mr. Benson, why is it that you always pick on the black kids in the hallway? And I'm like, what? I was like, I don't think I'm picking on the black kids in the hallway. He's like, yeah, you do. He's like, you'll see these white kids in the hallway congregating, but yet you pass them by and you make us move along first. You might talk to them after, but you always come right towards us first. I'm like, okay. All right, Derek. Well, thank you for letting me know. Now, some principals might have taken that and dismissed it and be like, I'm not, you're just trying to, tell me that I'm racist. I treat everyone fairly and dismiss it. But I was like, no, let me observe to see how this happens. And so what I did is, for the next week, I didn't ask anyone to move along. I went and watched the hallways on each floor. And Derek said, you and the other teachers do this. And I started watching how the teachers were acting, because they were just doing what they were asked. But more often than not, when there was a group of black students congregating, they would beeline to them, often passing by other white students who had congregated in the same way. I was like, holy smokes, this is happening. Same behavior, but because the students are black, there's more attention to them, and there's this idea that congregating black students are up to no good. These white students, they're okay. They're going to move along eventually, but we got to move along those black students. And so I had this conversation with my leadership team. I'm like, y'all, we're doing this. Watch. This is happening, and this is not good as far as the campus racial climate for our black students. And so after that, I was like, all right, guys, use the mantra whenever you go into the hallway. is to address the student, or address the behavior, not the student. And I would have to tell myself that 7 periods a day whenever I went to the hallway. That was my mantra: address the behavior, not the student. Address the behavior, not the student. Right? So I go to the hallway, and I had to really pay attention to, when I was going to clear students, clearing the white students. Right? I was like, all right, guys, move along, move along. And when we started doing that, what I noticed is that the white students started to get confused. They're like, what? We would never, this wasn't a problem before.
Right.
Why is it a problem now? Right? They were confused that now it was, and they're rightfully confused because they have privilege before.
Mm-hmm.
Rightfully confused because they were having privilege, not the rules didn't apply to them. And then what else was, when I was clearing the white students, by the time I got to the black students, they were already gone. Because they're like, oh, he's clearing white students now too. Like, yeah, they're really enforcing the rules. So that's what it means, that we have to pay attention to when there's a discrepancy in the way we're treating our students are showing up in our discipline system. That often means there's bias somewhere in the system. And we have to look for it, locate it, and understand how it's being disproportionately applied to our students of color. And that's just one example.
And I love that you didn't go to the obvious, like suspensions, and like you're talking about those everyday interactions that we might not understand that are happening, that are impacting our students. And it is really unconscious until it is. You're like, wait, what? Wait, I did? And until you took time to process that. So let me get into the structured expectations of fairness when it comes to discipline, because where do you see the current neuroscience and understanding the impacts of dysregulation on kids, right? You have a kid, doesn't matter who or where or what, but they're experiencing something in the environment outside of school. They come in escalated, right? You understand, I've got tons of kids coming through my mind of experiences, but they're experiencing all these things. They come to school, they're heightened. And yet you might have kids, and you don't know every kid's story. We don't know every kid's story, right? Which is why we treat every kid with a lot of pre-forgiveness and grace, and no accountability. But where do you balance between those structured, fair responses to ensure that there's equity without taking into account that every kid is in a different space, every kid is going through different things, and understanding the physiological and neurological responses to stress and trauma?
Right. And again, there can't be a one size fits all. Right. And I equate this to, how we operate as adults. Like, we have a lot of rules that we understand very well, right? And we don't want to get in trouble. Okay. And the best example I have is when you get on an airplane.
Right.
You get on an airplane and we know the rules and we sort of remember, but we're reminded every day. Every time we get on there, we sit down. These are the expected FAA regulations. Here's how you put on your seatbelt. Here's what to do in case we an emergency. You're not allowed to get up when we're taxiing. All these rules, all right, just so we know. And we all get on the plane at different states, but we know the expectations there, right? And so in a school, it has to be the same way. When students understand clearly the boundaries, and they're clearly defined and clearly enforced, you have much less problems. Yeah. Right. It's within these schools that you have these. Of course, we have to give grace to adults too, because we're not always consistent because we have our own stuff going on. Right. Even as a classroom teacher, I didn't show up always with the same even keel, sort of the even keel attitude. We have to get some grace too, that we're not always consistent ourselves. Sure. But far the most time, we have to be consistent from the classroom to the office. And if there is any sort of interface with in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, we have to do it humanely in a way that's very clear, that there's a clear expectation throughout the day. Because most students don't want to get in trouble. Even the ones that we call the high flyers who get in trouble a lot, they don't want to be suspended from school. And when there is evidence of those top 5% of students who are, who constantly do not fit within our infrastructure for behavior, we have to understand we have to create a new infrastructure and put the impetus on us. Like, this student is not being successful because the infrastructure we build up for behavior management doesn't work for them. Right? And we have to have trigger points that tell us that the student is telling us that this infrastructure is not working for me, because that's what behavior is telling us. That this current infrastructure, based on whatever I'm bringing to school, whatever I might be experiencing outside, this infrastructure is not working for me. And we have to say, okay, so what is our responsibility? What's the trigger point where we stop suspending kids and say, all right, what is the behavior management plan that's going to work for you? Because we want you here and we want you to learn. And that's the humanity that has to come back in, specifically to Black Black schools and also the low-income schools. We have to humanize these students again and not demonize their communities and put it on them for coming to school with high needs. We have to adjust our service delivery model.
Well, and I thought about your scenario of the airport, and I'm thinking, so what would happen if we're boarding the plane and somebody in the back starts screaming and yelling and is belligerent? I don't think we're going to follow those rules that we've been given, right? And I think that sometimes that's what's happening in spaces, not in schools, but what happens in your stress response when your cortisol levels are increasing and, you know, the neuroconnectivity is a little less, or the prefrontal cortex is being hijacked because your brain is discombobulated, and you walk into school, those expectations, right, are great. But until there is a regulation of your neurological and even physiological self, you may not be in the state to be able to respond to those expectations. And so I think that that's what I heard you saying, like, it may not work for every kid. And the reason is every kid isn't the same, and every kid need to have individualized understanding, not stories, not traumas, none of that. But it didn't work for me. I'm just going to be honest. Like, school did not work for me, and it didn't. And I didn't have major traumas or anything, but like it was just like, why, you know, of course, maybe I do question everything. Let's just be honest, Dr. Benson. Sometimes I just question things, but at the end of the day, I think the rigidity we have to be cautious of it, because it does leave an avenue. Let's be honest, again, going back to the system, what norm are we trying to prepare kids for in a school, right? What expectations and whose expectations are they trying to meet? I hear this all the time. Well, they're being disrespectful to me. And I think, wait, but you are being disrespectful to them as well. Like, the way you approached that situation was extremely disrespectful. So why would you assume, and why is it okay? Like, you know what I mean? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Right.
We've got to dig into that.
Right. I mean, it's a humanization.
That's
and
it.
I've worked in several different types of schools, right? Schools that serve, you know, high proportions of low-income kids, kids of color, the middle to high-income kids, and predominantly white kids. And you'll see the same behaviors, but they're treated differently. We give a lot more grace with the same behaviors to middle high-income white kids, especially white males, in terms of their behavior and leniency, in order to avoid suspension, in order to avoid removal. Really high level behaviors that they need time to talk. Come and sit in my office for a little bit, because I know your parents and they live in this community, and your dad's a lawyer, your mom's a doctor, right? So you get a lot more grace because I respect where you come from. We need to give that same grace to kids regardless of where they come from, and not just humanize those who we value.
And at the end of the day, that's the premise. That's the premise of what a great friend of mine calls healing-centered education, where we're meeting every kid where they are and giving them what we call pre-forgiveness in my school, right? It's like, no, let's meet them where they are. It doesn't matter who they are or where they are. We just meet them, and it's building capacity to meet their fullest potential. It's not what I want you to do. It's what you're capable of doing. And I think seeing kids in that way of, man, they have so much to offer the world and even us as educators, that we've got to be cautious of seeing every kid in this picture perfect, like this is what they should be doing right now because that's what I perceive should be done. But nonetheless,
yeah. And also balancing that with anti-racism, right? Because I do see 100%. Some folks going off the pendulum. Like, if you just do individualized education and we focus on the child and the whole child, that's going to solve for the racism our teachers and folks bring into the building. So we have to balance that and recognize that there's each individual kid, but we also bring our biases in, right? That sometimes is triggering the behaviors of what we see that shows up in the school building and attributing it to something outside, attributing it to the kids. So we have to be careful with that balance.
Yeah, and that's valid. And I think it's why you wrote your book, right? It's why we're having these conversations, because it is a balance. And I think that having these conversations, if I would have told you in high school that I would be talking to Dr. Benson about anti-racist education, I probably would have went, say, what? You? But this is what learning is. It's conversations, it's relationships, it's accountability, right? And I think you have a big piece in your book about that. So lastly, Dr. Benson, what do you want educators to know? if we have a lot of educators that listen to this podcast, what do you want them to know as kind of a final thought from you?
Well, what I want them to know is that we have a tremendous opportunity and tremendous responsibility. If we are not satisfied with what we're seeing in society about the polarization, specifically we are on race and acceptance and racism and the over-policing of Black communities and the George Floyd by many other names over and over again, we have a responsibility to carry forward the anti-racist work in our schools. Not just, teaching students how to talk about it and how to become more racially literate, but also to carry out anti-racist practices in our building. That we are a link in the chain. And we have the opportunity because everyone who becomes a police officer, everyone who becomes a teacher, everyone who becomes an official goes through our schools. We are educating the next generation of folks who are going to run this country. And if we don't like what we see and we want to change things for the better, it's our responsibility to be an anti-racist. And that's what I want folks to know.
And that is a great note. So if they want to follow you, follow your work, get your book, where can they find you on social media? And if you could reiterate, I'll show your book, but for the listeners that will listen to the actual podcast, they're not going to be able to see it. So where can they find you?
So you can get the book on Amazon and also at Harvard Education Press. They do bulk orders in case you want to buy it for your school district. Call them up, ask them for a discount. They do that. At my website is very easy, TraceyABenson.com, TraceyABenson.com. That's where you can find me. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Tracey Benson. I try my best to be very active and give folks the weekly dose of anti-racism. That's my commitment. A weekly dose of whether it's research, a story, or something I've written, or a podcast that I've been on. So you'll see this on, I'll retweet this. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, or you can just simply shoot me an email. All right, I have I do run the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute. That's my contribution. That we have this is our disruptive innovation, right? We don't just come in and have conversations for a day or two or three. We have a very intensive 10-hour program to deepen racial literacy and find our growth edge in terms of our internal work around anti-racism, combined with creating anti-racist strategic plans for school district leaders and education organization leaders, followed by 12 weeks, every other week for 1 hour with your anti-racist leadership coach when you comes to implementing the work. And that's where the rubber hits the road. And so we introduce a disruptive innovation that a lot of folks have lined up for. We have great success with a lot of organizations and school districts. And so if you're interested in really diving into the work in very substantive ways, come and join us. And you can find out more information about that on my website.
And for Pat Flora that asked, what's the title of your book? It is Unconscious Bias in Schools, A Developmental Approach to Exploring Race and Racism. And there it is. Here it is. Mine's got a lot of highlighting. And I have to say, your statement is fitting right along with a hashtag that I commonly use, and that's Disruptors Unite, because that's what it takes. It takes us to go on that edge of being uncomfortable, and pushing the work that we know needs to be done. So just a reminder, too, we do have the Trauma Informed Educators Network Conference coming up in July 19th through the 21st. And we're talking about integrating schools. We have a keynote speaker who is a great friend of mine, Dr. Ricky Gibbs, who was featured on the podcast The Promise that talked about just that and the interesting conversations that happened around it. So if you haven't listened to The Promise, please do. And if you want to register for the conference, you can go to paradigmshifteducation.com. We have plenty of registrations left. I cannot wait to get all of the disruptors to unite so we can come together around this work. And if you want to follow me, you can follow me right there, Principal List, and a variety of other spaces on LinkedIn, Matthew Portell, and on Twitter and Instagram is Principal List. So thank you all for listening, and please, please, please continue to wash your hands, and if need, wear a mask. All right, we're still live, but I just stopped the podcast. Dr. Benson, thank you so much, man. I think we could probably talk for days and hours, and I'll reach out to you. I want to get a, have you ever met Ingrid Cochran?
I don't recognize that.
She works for Paces Connection, which is Positive Adverse Childhood Experiences. It used to be ACEs Connection. She was on here, and we had a great conversation. She asked me the question, so how do you teach your son whiteness? We talked about racial trauma and historical trauma, and that question, when I tell you, it spun me going, oh my gosh, like what a powerful question, because I don't have to, because we're norm. Anyway, I would love to get a couple of and Dr. Ricky Gibbs, who I mentioned, he was also on the podcast, who was on The Promise. Have you listened to The Promise by chance? Oh yeah. If you get a minute, you want to listen to a great podcast, if you're ever commuting, just listen to it. It was put on by, oh, it's so good. But he is a force. I would love to get a conversation with maybe a few other people, because we could talk for a long time. And I appreciate your candidness. And I appreciate the dialogue.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate the work you're doing, and thanks for inviting me on the show. You know, this is the wave of what we have to make as a part of our work, right? And the things that we do, normalize it. That it's a standalone. It's a part of what folks talk about, along with what's the racial dynamics to what we do in school. So I appreciate you including me in this conversation and promoting my work. And I hope I'm a part of your network now. So anytime I'm here, and likewise, I would love to be able to reach out to you when appropriate, but I definitely appreciate you including me in your sort of project and what you're
anytime doing. And I'm gonna end the live. We can tell everybody bye, and then I gotta ask you something after we end the live. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next week. Oh, next week is Melissa Sadin from the Attachment and Trauma Network, and the week after that is Dr. Bruce Perry, who recently just co-authored a book with Oprah called What Happened to You, that is already a New York Times bestseller. So we will talk to those two amazing folks the next 2 weeks, and we'll see you then.